Ladies and gentlemen, if I can have your attention, please. Good evening. I'm Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and it's my great and very brief pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's event. We have a number of people who really don't need any introduction, but I'm going to let Stephen Loosely be the person who does the introductions. I really just wanted to say thanks for coming. I'm looking forward to what I think is going to be a stimulating and, I have no doubt, given the speakers, amusing and interesting discussion around the US presidential election. And without further ado, let me hand over to Stephen Loosely. Stephen.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome to everyone tonight to our forum. On November 8, 2016, will the US presidential ballot have Australian consequences? And we're privileged tonight to have two of the most astute and insightful observers of US politics with her. I'm referring, of course, to Ambassador Kim Beazley and to Tom Switzer. Ambassador Beazley has a distinguished career in the Australian Parliament and in Washington, DC, having been Defence Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Leader of the Federal Opposition, before taking on the diplomatic role, where it's agreed right across the aisle Kim did a superb job in representing our interests. Tom Switzer, also a friend like Kim, is forging a most distinguished career. I first met Tom when he was opinion editor of The Australian, where he did a splendid job. He's moved now to the United States Studies Centre as a lecturer, and he also is a senior correspondent with the ABC. So it's really good to have two people who are informed and engaged by US politics. Just to set the stage, as everyone in this room is aware, every 4 years the United States has a global ballot in which only American citizens have the franchise. But the consequences reach well beyond the borders of the American Republic, as we're seeing at the moment. And Kim had a few things by way of observation in that in this morning's Australian and beyond. Set the stage, about 126 million voters will decide who is the 45th President of the US. The two candidates as established by their respective conventions, the Republicans out of Cleveland in Donald J. Trump and the Democrats out of Philadelphia in Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. The American electorate, of course, decides the presidency by way of an electoral college. 538 votes, based in the states and the District of Columbia in proportion to the representation in the United States Congress. This has been the case since the earliest days of the Republic. 270 needed to win. The Democrats have a considered advantage going into this election. The respected and enormously influential commentator George F. Will, who has left the Republican Party over the Trump candidacy, I might observe in passing, has pointed out that in the last 6 presidential elections, the Democratic Party has routinely carried 18 states and DC for a total of 242 electoral college votes. 270 needed to win. The Republicans, on the other hand, routinely carry 13 states for a combined total of 102 votes. So in other words, statistically, there are a number of pathways for the Democrats to win the presidency. It's more challenging for the Republicans. The Democrats, of course, have a lock on the west coast of the United States, the left coast, which stretches into Nevada, and a lock in the northeast. The Republicans must win all the states of the old Confederacy, including Florida and Virginia, all the plain states, all the mountain states, and all the states of the Southwest, if they're to win the presidency. So there are real challenges. An observation about the nature of the United States electorate: it divides roughly 3 ways. 30% are registered Republicans, 40% are registered Democrats, 30% are independents, which is why reaching out to independents, as Michael Bloomberg did at the Democratic Convention, is just so important. Minorities will determine the outcome. Approximately 30% of American voters come from minority communities: Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans. There's a lot of talk about the white vote electing Donald Trump. This is a real challenge. In 1980 against President Carter, Governor Ronald Reagan won 56% of the white vote. Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote against Barack Obama. Reagan won easily. Romney was defeated overwhelmingly. So there are lots of challenges that are inherent in this election. The issues are there, ranging from the domestic American challenges, such as the immigration circumstances, through to America's alliances. Much talk about NATO, much talk about relations in the Far East. Australia, of course, faces serious challenges if the Pars Americana, which Harry Truman began to construct in 1946, begins to break down. I will leave it at that. I'm going to ask Kim to speak for approximately 10 or 12 minutes, followed by Tom, and then we'll have a Q&A in which everyone will have the chance to put some probing questions to our two speakers. But could we begin by inviting Ambassador Kim Beazley to come to the lectern. Kim?
Yeah, I used to start often when I was first ambassador to the US with a discussion about how Australia saw the world by citing evidence that more Australians were interested in US politics than Americans. And my evidence was from the Pew Research of the 2008 election, asking the American folk the question as to who was interested in the American election campaign. 83% responded that they were. When Australians were asked the same question about the same election, 84% said they are interested. So we are more interested. That point that Stephen made about the Americans conducting a global ballot with only Americans franchised absolutely is how the world has for a very long time seen American politics. It struck me, this is a week in which I'm making a couple of speeches a day here in Canberra, but I started with a bunch of accountants in Perth and was trying to think of something to talk about in relation to the election that's had some meaning for defence policy and the like, some projection forward. And to pick up on a theme of Steve's, I think this probably is the most single important fact about where the election is at this point for those outside the United States looking for the potential impact of the election on them. And that is this: Trump, who is a mountebank, a criminal, and an individual who has basically trashed every single principle of American international diplomacy and stance on trade, is a serial underpayer of his workers, a serial cheater of his subcontractors, has nevertheless found himself in this position. No matter what else happens on election day, Trump will poll a majority of the white vote. Now, contemplate what that means. The white American population since World War II has been that portion of the American population which swung away from its isolationism to take upon itself a preparedness to be destroyed by nuclear weapons should there be an outbreak of fighting that threatened the freedom of their allies in a way that obliged a discharge of them. This white population was prepared to be destroyed for all of us. Now, that is a Hegelian aspect of self-sacrifice that has no historical precedent. It was a product of really tough men and women who had experienced some of the worst fighting in World War II and understood that if the United States did not play that international role, the chances for any form of stability in global politics was gone. Now, this was not simply a perception of an American elite. This was accepted by the broad American working class as a reasonable outcome. Now, we can go through all the shenanigans that occurred during the Cold War, all the unrealities in analysis by one side or the other, all the extremities associated with McCarthyism. You can do all of that. But the truth is, this population sustained a level of internationalism that was important to the freedom of all of us. These are the people voting for Trump. The African American community, the Hispanic community, the Asian community in the United States, they've all had perspectives. But most of their views of the world have been pitched towards access and equality in the United States, opportunity in the US. They have not sat down and thought their way through America's global role as a fundamental leitmotif of their political outlook. So we now have the sight of this. These folk are basically the folk who were responsible for American globalism are turning away from it. The Americans, I think, will probably elect a global-oriented candidate and probably, and I do agree with Obama on this, the best qualified candidate that has run for the US presidency in our memory. That doesn't mean you have to agree with her, but if you actually look at her qualifications, pure and simple, the best qualified candidate to contest the US president, and she may win. She will win, however, on the votes of those least connected to the American international and global role. They will not be in a position necessarily of sharing her convictions, but of trusting her. Trusting her in the sense of the policies that they have pursued, the positions that they have pursued to protect their entry into the American political system. In other words, they're not voting for on trade policy, they're not voting for on foreign policy, they're not objecting to Trump on trade and foreign policy, except insofar as that impacts immigration policy. They're voting against him because they believe he will seriously damage their interests at home. So this is for an ally of the United States an appalling setting. This is something that probably is not going to change, whatever the outcome of this election is, and that is something that we're going to have to think about very carefully in the future. It's a product of a variety of phenomena. One is the feeling that America is overextended. There is that feeling amongst some in that community. But it is more a reaction to what they believe is disrespect. It's extraordinary that Trump would be the vehicle of conveying a response to folk who feel disrespect. But if you slice and dice the American community by gender, by ethnicity, and by class, and so you put those criteria in place, determine who the big voters are. The second biggest voting group is white working class males. And this is the fundamental group behind Trump. And they are behind Trump because they have been economically dispossessed. They have not had a real wage rise for 30 years. Our working class in that period of time has had a real wage rise 2.5-fold. In 1983, the value of their wealth was about $80,000. In 2008, after the global financial crisis, in 2005, before the global financial crisis, that had grown to $140,000. Last year, it was $83,000. They are starting to turn out this stat. Ask the white community, will your kids be better off than you? 56% say no. Ask the African community, 44% say no. Ask the Hispanic community, 30% say no. The majority of white Americans believe their kids have a lesser future than they had. There is with this group, the focal point of their hatred is this. And this is why they'll accept so much from Trump. The focal point of their hatred is American trade policy and the belief that they have been rendered jobless by its application. The second factor is the illegal migration. The believing that illegal migrants have dragged down base rates and that has had an impact on their incomes. The group also believes that the system has been skewed by the elite who are benefiting themselves from the way in which it has developed and that they are the recipients of their tax dollars when they're bailed out, and the other recipients are those associated with those who've dragged their wages down. In addition to that, they have an array of social objections to the direction, which are generally conservative social directions, to the directions of those they believe mock them. And that's an interesting thing too. I remember I used to have these Grange and steak nights followed by cigars for different, which I'd break the Australian law by smoking on an Australian premises. And you'd sit, I had, at one of these sessions, I had Haley Barbour, who used to be Governor of Mississippi and one time Chairman of the Republican Party. This is about 18 months, a bit longer ago than that now. He asked me the question, what do you think about the Republican Party, Kim? I said, I'll tell you this, you are now the party of the white working class. The problem is you indulge yourselves by feeling that the only thing they want to hear about is your views on abortion, your views on gays, your views on guns, and that you have covered the working class agenda by the responses that you have put in place on that. The problem with you is you don't represent their interests. That's a very big problem for you. You do not represent their interests. And fairly soon, a populist candidate is going to come into your presidential campaign and he's going to rip the guts out of the Republican Party, because these are the people you've made the essential element of your base. I never thought it would have been Trump. I would not have ever put Trump down as the guy who would actually be able to articulate a position that gets them. However, that having been said, and though they are the second biggest group on that slice and dice chart that I've notionally given you, they're not enough to get elected. If you look at some of the bases of it, in 1993, when Bill Clinton won, 51% of Americans identified themselves as white Protestants. That figure is now 31%. 87% of the electorate then was white. The figure is, as Steve pointed out, now going to be less than 70% in this election campaign. The biggest group is white working class women. They're the biggest group, and they are a large slice. The American electorate is feminised generally, 53-47. But the biggest group on that chart that I've notionally put up, white working class women, and of course then you get into the sisters higher up the economic scale, and for that matter the men higher up the economic scale. And how they vote is going to be absolutely crucial. 55% of married women, that doesn't just include white married women, but 55% of married women in the last election voted for Romney. 60% of single women voted for Obama, and they're the majority of women. But the wives of these fellows who are disenchanted are going to be crucial. Let's assume that about 55%, probably a bit more, voted for Romney. Well, they are women brought up in an atmosphere where the first child they've had to look after is their husbands. And they will not necessarily take the view that what they hear Jim Bob and his mates talk about over the barbecue with a beer in the hand represents ultimate wisdom. And they may well take the view that they're incapable of dispensing it and that they'll go with Hillary. Trump will be counting on the white working class enrolling and voting in numbers they never have before. Hillary will be counting on women counteracting that by slightly lowering the percentage in the married case who vote Republican, and likewise increase the majority that she has among single women. If they balance out, another factor will come into play which will absolutely destroy Trump in the election, and I'll finish with this. There is another group mobilising, and they have been mobilising well before this election, since the last election, as the Hispanic Society of the United States is now a large, vibrant, self-served society, its own media, its own social construct, its own religion, and a superb social organisation, and a Hispanic fixation with politics, which is vastly greater than an Anglo-Saxon fixation with politics, and is largely the reason why Spain is ungovernable. But nevertheless, they bring to play a really devoted view, and they've learned this. There were 23 million of them entitled to vote at the last election, but only 11 million did. And they have systematically, and this has gone into overdrive, set about fixing that since the last election. And they've been joined in one or two areas by serendipity. So, for example, in Florida, a marginal, hitherto purple state, famously won by George W. Bush and the hanging chads and the like, 1 million folk from Puerto Rico have moved into Florida since the last election, escaping economic conditions in that country. The significance of that is they've all got the vote. At least all those of an adult character have got the vote, because they're American citizens. And they are being marshalled, and I would say Florida may well already be beyond Trump, no matter what you might see in the polling when you see that sort of vote. If they turn out in numbers, George W. got 36% of them when he won. McCain and Romney got 27, 28% of them when they lost. Trump is currently polling 10. So that is going to be the icing on the cake of a substantial Hillary victory. Touch wood. Thanks very much.
Very good, Mike. Very good.
Thank you, Kim. Before I ask Tom to step up, the presidential election 2016 appears to be going in the direction of a referendum on Donald Trump. Trump is authentically American, there's no question about that, but he's not uniquely American. I just make this observation in passing. If Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the British Labor Party, had run for the Democratic nomination for president, he would have sounded a lot like Bernie Sanders. And if Marine Le Pen were running for the Republican nomination, she'd sound a lot like Donald Trump. So there are populist movements about the place. People say to me, can you ever remember an election like this? The truthful answer is no, but 1964 comes close. Barry Goldwater ran a shambolic campaign against Lyndon Johnson, was annihilated in the polls. Have a look at some of the Democrats' ads in that election, and you can see what's coming down the track against Trump, particularly on nuclear weapons. We talked in terms of where the party's strengths are. I just mentioned two states that I think are really going to be interesting on the 8th of November. Arizona, where Senator John McCain is fighting for his political life because Trump is at the top of the ticket. When Hispanics are polled, by the way, 77% declare for Hillary Clinton. And 70% of that group venture something else, that they despise Donald Trump. So Kim's absolutely right on Florida. I think it's already beyond reach. David Plouffe, who was one of Obama's campaign directors, thought a year ago it was beyond reach of a Republican. The Republican Party is in danger of becoming a sectional rather than a national political organisation. Arizona is one to watch, and Utah is one to watch. There's another candidate come into the field with a national security background. The Libertarian candidate is one whom Mitt Romney particularly likes. When Trump was campaigning in the primary out in Utah, he asked his audience the question, is Mitt Romney really a Mormon? Now, you don't question someone's faith in our politics. You certainly don't question someone's faith in American politics. So there's a rejoinder coming there. Our second speaker tonight is from the ABC, with a very distinguished record at the US Study Centre, and as the editor of The Spectator and the opinion editor of The Australian, and before that, I think, Tom, the Australian Financial Review. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome Tom Switzer?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Kim, and thank you, Peter Jennings and friends of ASPI for having me here today. Look, it's hard to disagree with anything I've heard so far. I mean, we want a debate, so I'll try to say some things that are a bit different, either now or in the panel discussion. And I certainly can't beat Kim's personal anecdotes about Australian attitudes towards the United States, but I can tell you about a joke that, well, it wasn't really a joke, but it was something that Thomas Jefferson said more than 2 centuries ago. He said that everyone has 2 favourite countries, their own and France. Well, I think today it's fair to say that everyone has 2 favourite countries, their own and the United States. And I was reminded of this in March of last year. I was working at the ABC Bureau in Brisbane, and I'll never forget, it was the day that Ted Cruz announced that he was running for president. Now, at the time, Ted Cruz was not really well known at all, even among a lot of journalists who are interested in international affairs. He was a fire breather in the Senate who helped bring about budget crises and budget lockdowns and shutdowns, but he wasn't really that well known. But on this day, I'm not kidding you, I must have received about 6 to 8 media requests to talk about Ted Cruz. And yet on the same very day, the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, called formal proceedings for the beginning of the election. And there was hardly any media attention at all in the Australian debate. I find that quite intriguing, that the Prime Minister of Britain calls an election, it doesn't get much attention at all, if any, on the ABC that night, and yet Ted Cruz got all this attention. So I think that's just a reminder of how we are so focused on America, and I think, as someone who makes a living out of this, it's a good thing, but it's nevertheless very intriguing. On Donald Trump, and I should declare an interest, like virtually all seasoned observers of American politics, I'm still wiping the egg off my face, like virtually everyone else. I've not taken him seriously throughout the course of last year, and even throughout the early part of this year. But the reality is, for better or for worse, and the consensus here is that it's for the worse, he has nevertheless resonated with a significant segment of Americans, predominantly white working class, but it's not just the white working class. All the available public opinion polling evidence indicates that 70% of the American people think their country is heading in the wrong direction, that it's in serious long-term decline, and moreover, trust in American government and institutions is at an all-time low. Now, these polling figures precede President Obama, probably goes back to about 2004, 2005, but they're consistent enough to make you realise that this is an enduring trend. There are a lot of people in America who are in a foul mood for the reasons that both Kim and Stephen mentioned. And for anyone who's interested in this issue, I can't recommend an article highly enough. It's Francis Fukuyama in the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. And he makes the point that, and he's not a Trump supporter or a Sanders supporter. Bernie Sanders, of course, was the socialist candidate who gave Hillary Clinton a real run for her money in the Democratic primaries. But his point is that what the real meaning of this election shows is that American democracy is finally catching up with 2 decades of wage stagnation, widening income inequality. And added to this, we've had the most sluggish economic recovery since the Great Depression. It's largely due to the Great Recession, of course, in 2008, 2009. But the reality is the Obama recovery is nothing compared to the Clinton recovery of the 1990s or the Reagan recovery of the 1980s. And Trump resonates with a lot of these folks who are disoriented. I mean, you may know his campaign motto is "Let's make America great again," which happened to be, intriguingly, Ronald Reagan's campaign motto in 1980. But he resonates with a lot of folks. They think their country is heading in the wrong direction. And so he's running a real populist campaign that, as Stephen said, it's not all that dissimilar to what we're seeing in many parts of Western and Eastern Europe. And in the process of running this populist campaign, he's upending the central pillars of the Republican Party that have been in place since Ronald Reagan's ascendancy in the late 1970s. You know, the Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, Newt Gingrich, intriguingly a supporter of Trump's, but leaving that aside, George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney, all of the main Republican leaders on Capitol Hill and at the presidential level have all believed in free markets and free trade and a global leadership role and social conservatism and inclusive conservatism. Donald Trump is none of those things. So in many respects, as Stephen just mentioned, Trump is not all that dissimilar to those populist and nationalist movements that are threatening established parties all across the continent, the European continent. There is a pathway for Trump, and it's this, that if he wins the states that Mitt Romney won, and finds a way of winning the Rust Belt. Now, the Rust Belt are states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio. 3 of those 4 states have voted Democrat in every presidential election since the mid to late 1980s. And of course, a Republican who wins the White House always has to win Ohio. That's the record. So Trump needs to win the Rust Belt. He needs to win Florida, and he needs to win a couple of other states that Mitt Romney did not win. Now, that's a tough battle. But if he can find a way of enthusing that angry white male, and remember in 2012, according to Sean Trendy, the pollster, 5 million working class white folks did not vote. They didn't vote for Romney because they thought he was a vulture capitalist, and they didn't vote for Barack Obama. And if the argument here is that if Trump can win over these folks while at the same time ensuring that Hillary Clinton's vote is mediocre, he has a decent shot. But as most of the experts say, it's an uphill battle. I think, for what it's worth, and I've been making this argument consistently, I think that Donald Trump's divisive rhetoric, his erratic behaviour, his lack of any core governing philosophy means that he is more than likely going to splinter the Republican Party, and we've seen just in the last 24, 48 hours a prominent senator, Republican Senator Susan Collins from Maine, come out against him. She had an op-ed piece in the Washington Post. So splinter the Republican Party, alienate minorities, especially the Hispanics that Stephen mentioned, upset women, turn off a lot of independents that often swing elections, and moreover unite divided Democrats, because that's another story, no one's mentioned this yet, but the Democrats are very divided, not as divided as the Republicans, but as Sanders showed, they are very divided. Trump can unite these Democrats behind what is really a flawed candidate, despite her impressive resume. I mean, Hillary Clinton is widely perceived as untrustworthy. She has very high negatives of self. So my point here is that Trump, all things considered, is more than likely going to lose this election. And I think, as Stephen suggested and Kim alluded to, probably big, probably worse than Mitt Romney's loss to Barack Obama. It won't be as big as 1964. I mean, 1964 was Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory over Barry Goldwater. Nor will it be as big as Richard Nixon's landslide over George McGovern in 1972. Nor will it be as big as Ronald Reagan's landslide in 1984 against Walter Mondale, but it'll probably be a crushing victory. And I think that's probably the view of the betting markets, the polls, and most of the so-called experts. Let me just finish on one final note, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. On foreign policy, as Kim mentioned eloquently this morning on the ABC AM program and in the Australian and in ASPI, it would be a disastrous foreign policy. I mean, he is strikingly ignorant of a lot of issues, and he's a loose cannon. And that's a deadly combination. And I think that's why 50 prominent Republican strategists came out yesterday to condemn him, that he doesn't have the temperament. All true. But can I distinguish myself from Kim and perhaps Stephen by saying we should remember that many of the people who are attracted to Trump, and indeed Bernie Sanders, they themselves think that US foreign policy in the post-Cold War era has itself been a disaster. And it's not an implausible charge. In December, we see the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the United States has been at war in 22 out of 25 of those years, and there is no end in sight. During that period, America's prestige and credibility has dissipated. Its power to influence and lead, some might say to overwar, has been reduced, which is a crying shame. Some might say that NATO expansion, certainly this is Trump's argument, has actually pushed Russia closer to China, which has culminated in China and Japan doing joint naval exercises in September, we're told. China and Russia. And there's a widespread perception, many of us may not agree with it, but there's a perception on the left and on the right that the foreign free trade deals that the foreign policy elite in Washington have pushed during the course of the last 25 years have, among other things, disoriented so many folks. They've been disoriented by the pace of radical socio-economic change and globalisation, taken together with immigration and especially technology, has disabled them. Their way of life has changed dramatically. They're disoriented, they're angry, and they're crying for help. And here's a guy, at long last, who speaks their language. So I think we should bear that in mind. These are significant segments of Americans who are tired of the world. They're suffering from foreign policy fatigue. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're attracted to Donald Trump. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree, two first-class contributions. Could I also note that we're joined tonight by Congresswoman Gay Brotman. Thanks for joining us, Gay, a good friend of ASPI. Now, it's been very heavy going so far, so a light note for 30 seconds. 1964, I mentioned the Democrats' advertising, one of which is the most successful negative ad ever portrayed on television, the so-called Daisy Cutter ad, but I'll leave it to you to find on YouTube for those of you who may not have seen it. But the Goldwater campaign produced a classic ad too of Mount Rushmore, but not 4 presidents on it, there were 5 presidential heads, the 5th being Barry Goldwater. And the slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." Within 24 hours, the Democrats came back with, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." Ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you. We're in Q&A for either Kim or Tom or both. Yes, at the back there.
You've talked a lot about the presidential election. Now, that's only one part of the triad. How is the election, that campaign, going to affect the legislative, and particularly the efforts in the Republican states of gerrymandering the electoral rolls and access to the vote?
The gerrymander is real and big. You know, there's 2 states, Nebraska and I think Maine, that vote because how the Electoral College is structured and operates is a state-based phenomenon. It's the states have the right to determine how their delegates shall behave at the Electoral College. And currently, 48 of them decide that the winner of the state takes all the delegates to the Electoral College. However, in Maine and Nebraska, there's a combination of factors, but it ends up being a congressional constituency-based division. So, in other words, you have a couple from, if you've got 4 states, 2 electoral divisions, 4 votes, 2 electoral divisions, 2 each. So it depends on the outcome in those divisions as to what happens. Now, if every state had done that at the last election, Obama won by 5 million votes and about 130, I think it was, in the Electoral College. had they done it on the basis of the congressional divisions, and I'm not taking the votes of the Congress, I'm taking the votes of Romney and Obama in those electoral divisions, Romney would have won by 226 to 209. So that gives you an understanding of the character of the gerrymander. Romney would have won the last election if all the states voted like Nebraska and Maine. The gerrymander has intensified since then. So with the High Court's decision stopping automatic Justice Department intervention has mild Jim Crow has started to proliferate through the various states, mostly in states that are virtually never going to be won by the Democrats, or unlikely to be won by the Democrats, but also in some which are. The one in North Carolina, which might have been, was struck down by the senior federal court, and because the Supreme Court is currently divided for all, a tied vote sends the decision back to the level at which the last decision was taken, and that means that the Jim Crow laws in North Carolina have been knocked out. But I think there are 10 or 11 other states who have put them in place since then. Nobody's too fussed about it because nobody sees it as massively impactful on the election. The gerrymandering was started by the Black Caucus and supported by the Democrats to try to ensure that African Americans actually represented African Americans. The Republicans originally opposed it, and then all of a sudden it struck them like a silver bullet. Well, we can stack all the African Americans into one constituency. Terrific. So you have, I think that now I can be checked on the figures here. I'll do it roughly. Last congressional election, North Carolina, I think it was 9 Republicans to 4 Democrats elected. In the congressional vote, the Democrats polled 52 to 48. So that shows you how the impact of that gerrymander can work. It is unlikely. I mean, I have a friend, Whit Ayres, who is the pollster for Rubio, and I was in America a few weeks ago, and I sat down with him for dinner at his place, and he'd just been with his various other Republican pollsters having a talk about the world, and they were furious at Comey and Lynch for failing to prosecute Hillary. And he just, hang on here, fellas, hang on. Hillary was prosecuted, her delegates would not go to Sanders, they'd go to Biden in the Democratic convention. Biden would dismantle you in detail. He would take at least 3/4 of the states, he would annihilate most of the senators up for re-election, and he'd take 50 seats off you in the House. That is where Trump potentially, in his judgment, has left the Republican Party. That this won't occur is largely due to the effective demonisation of Hillary. Whether you think it's for good reasons or bad reasons, it's a fact. So she would probably, let's say she gets somewhere around a victory somewhere around Obama's level. She'll probably get to a 50-50 in the Senate with her vice president with a casting vote, probably. She'll probably pick up a dozen seats in the House, the Republican majority there largely intact, and God knows what happens at the various state levels in the ballots that are being held there. But I would say that even though I think Hillary will win comfortably, I do take note of what Todd had to say, particularly just in case those Rust Belts go wonky. You worry about lots of little things. I'm not sure about Hillary's health. And then you look at what Trump is now being briefed on. Trump is now being briefed on what turns American presidents grey. Threats to the United States. The president wakes up every morning with a telephone book, and it changes its content each morning, and it records the latest detection of intended attacks on the United States, including the possibility of nuclear weapons having gone rogue and not identified. and a range of other things. There's usually been 10,000 cyber attacks on the US during the course of that, most of them by rat bags, but some of them by, initiated by serious players. And he gets worried sick. That's how he starts the morning before his Wheaties. And and Trump is now getting something like that briefing. He may sober up. Not much indication to date, but if he does sober up, the bar for Trump is very low. Very low. The bar for Hillary is very high. And if Trump sort of looks as though he can walk and talk half like a president. There's weird stories, I'm going to finish with this, but you've given us an opening. There's weird stories circulating. I picked up one when I was in the States and discounted it. But it was a fellow who'd been tangentially involved in the questioning of Pence as to what he was prepared to do as a vice president, his attitudes and all that sort of thing. In the course of which Pence, according to this bloke, was allegedly asked, would you be prepared to run the foreign and domestic policies of the United States? To which Pence said, well, odd question, not elected president, but yes, I dismissed it. He had a corollary on that one too. But then I see Kasich has now come out, or Sir Kasich supporters, and said he was asked that question. So I now assume it's credible. What the coda was to it was he did naturally ask, well, what would the president be doing? He started by saying, make America great again, but implement his agenda. Trump wants to concentrate thoroughly on his wall, on his attacks on illegal migrants, on preventing Muslims coming into the United States, on eliminating trade agreements, north and south and elsewhere, working out how he can harass them because he wants to devote. He does not want to disappoint that working class following of his. A reality TV star has to stay credible. So that's whatever the result in the Senate or in the House. It won't be a check on him. All the things that he can do in that area, what you might call among the negative powers of the president. He doesn't need Congress for, well, he needs Congress for hardly any of it.
Neil.
Neil Jones from the Defence Association. A real quick question, but in slightly two angles. Trump loses dramatically. What then happens in the United States with the rise of isolationist settlement, isolationist resentment, because it'll still be there? And secondly, what would happen if either candidate was taken out by an assassin?
Tom?
Well done, mate. Off you go.
You're talking about in the next 3 months a candidate being taken out?
Yeah, as a candidate, they're
Right.
taken out as a candidate. How would that affect them?
It's a very good question. It would be an uncharted territory. I'm thinking of historical analogies. Usually it's a president. It's been 5 presidents who've been assassinated. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, this would obviously be up to the Democratic National Committee, or Hillary, or the Republican National Committee. It's conceivable, probably likely, that the VP would step in, the running mate would step in, but I don't know the exact answer. That this is something that hasn't happened before. With respect to your first question, well, look, I was struck by a lot of the public opinion polling, Chicago Council, Pew in 12, President Obama's, one of his keynote messages was, nation building begins at home. And he knew that, as I mentioned before, the same folks who were attracted to Trump were not an isolated group. You know, America's been through a lot in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya. They're war weary, they're tired of the world. And the polls that I just mentioned were saying something like, I think in June 2013, 55% of the American people wanted America to mind its own business in the world. They were the words. Now, that's quite extraordinary. I would argue we didn't even see those kind of polling numbers even after the debacle in Vietnam in the mid-70s. I think you have to go back to the interwar years. There probably wasn't very good public opinion polling back then, but interwar years in the 1920s and 1930s to see that level of neo-isolationism and sense of withdrawal. And I do think that Trump is tapping into a sense that something's wrong with America's place in the world. But I think that the party elites, both the Democrat and the Republican, remain strongly internationalist. And to the extent that they still have a lot of sway in their party, then Washington will ensure that America remains, the global hegemon that clearly is not just the balancer of last resort, but the balancer of first resort. But the key question will be what happens over the next 4 to 8 years. Will we see a more creditable, sophisticated realist in the, say, Henry Kissinger or Richard Nixon mould, who moulds public opinion and puts Trump's foreign policy view in a more sophisticated lens? That's more conceivable.
I think there is a dynamic in global politics. If the American president is a halfway reasonable human being, that irrespective of domestic opinion, obliges the American president to act. And that by and large, if the decisions are seen as credible and based on good information, the public will be with them, even if the public is disgruntled about it. I used to, on Afghanistan and on Iraq and the like, our opinion polls in Australia were opposed sending troops overseas. And when Americans used to ask me about it, I said, well, yeah, that's how they automatically respond. They just don't do anything about it. And they said, well, that is one of these sort of fascinations of Australian leaders, which we let them get on with, and we'll focus on what they're doing domestically as to which way we're going to vote. So, but for Americans, I think in the end, if Hillary was elected, that would become the motion. Maybe not on trade, however. There are some things here where she's going to struggle, and a lot of it will depend on what credibility she gives herself by implementing the policies that she's put forward to produce greater equality in the United States, and just look as though she is pursuing those things seriously. She will, because she's a policy nut, and she'll do the best she can, and she will try to talk to Republicans about it. And I don't think they'll treat her in the same way that they did Obama. So that's the sort of the outcome on it. But on assassination, there are 300 million weapons in the United States, in the hands of about 25% of the population, 1% of which is clinically insane, and half of them are capable of shooting straight at 400 metres. So, what is the, what's going to happen?
Neil's question about the future of the Republican Party, one observation: after the 2012 loss, the Republican National Committee, and Reince Priebus said this openly, said the party had to be more inclusive and reach out to more minorities. They've gone in exactly the opposite direction. And the losses amongst Hispanic voters, who should be a natural Republican constituency, hasn't happened overnight. It began happening in the late 90s out in California, when Governor Pete Wilson backed Proposition 187, which denied schooling and hospital care to the families of undocumented aliens. And the thing that continues to happen is Hispanics embedding themselves in the Democratic coalition. If that continues, in the next 4 to 8 years, the state of Texas will revert to Democratic control. And the Republicans cannot win the presidency if and when that happens. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ambassador Beazley, I'm interested in your thoughts on anti-trade sentiment in the US. You said that it has become sort of the focal point of whitewashing plus hatred.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you thought that that had been a position that those voters reached by themselves, or is it something that candidates like Trump and Sanders led into, and if a Clinton presidency could turn that around?
It precedes them. I mean, the Democrats who are for trade, there's about 28 of them in the, I think there's about 190 in their caucus, and 28 of them support the TPP and support pro-trade positions. I used to have dinners for them regularly just to try to keep courage up. And I used to go and debate trade unions and their constituencies, or one or two of them anyway, on the subject of trade and who benefited from it. The TPP is, we grit our teeth as we look at it, and others do too. It's a massive gift to the United States. So I used to tell, when I've had these horror stories told by the trade union blokes I was debating, I said, your current rate of protection for manufacturing industry is 1.5%. When the TPP is legislated, your rate of protection will be 1.5%. So this is, you have given at the office. This is the markets that you have been excluded from opening to you. So whatever you think about NAFTA, whatever you think about the operation of the WTO generally, this is an American agreement. That had absolutely no weight, because the attitude of the TPP is about identity politics, not trade politics. This is about the working class saying they have been neglected. Doesn't matter what's the content of the treaty is, somebody must be punished. They're not completely confident that NAFTA would be abolished or whatever. They understand the complexities there. But they sure as hell know they can kill the TPP. But it's caught up not so much in a trade debate, it's caught up in an identity debate. The thing about trade is that basically Americans massively benefit from it. Yes, they went through NAFTA. Yes, they went through, deregulation and the rest of it. That created 6 times as many jobs as it lost. The problem is, the jobs lost were exclusively among the people that we've been talking about, and they haven't got them back.
That's right. Yeah.
And the folk who've got the jobs don't know they've got them as a result of trade. The guys who lose it did. I think now this is where Tom and I will disagree. I think the problem is that there's 2 elements that I used to try to explain to them and could when debating, and that is, the first is overwhelmingly what's changed the workplace is technological change. And the US industry is coming back. They're now very competitive with China, though their main competitor, and they never realised that, is not China, but Germany. And Germany competes unfairly because it invented that excrescence, the euro. But fortunately, if something's going to happen and collapse soon, it'll be that one. And then the German mark will come in at about 3 times the rate of value of the euro, and Germany will be hauled back to the ruck in its competition with the Americans. But it's basically technological change that has killed them. The other thing is it's the end of trade unions. One section of the white working class voted for Hillary Clinton. No section of the white working class voted for Bernie Sanders. None. One section of the white working class voted for Hillary, and that's the unionised white working class in some of the big states. In the private sector, they constitute about 6% of the workforce, and their agreements cover about 6%. In Australia, it's low too. Coverage in the unions in the private sector is about 13%. But because of industry and area bargaining, I think it is still the case that covers about 35% of Australian wages. Now, 6% is one thing, 35% is another. America is still massively industrial. One of the biggest vehicle provinces in the world, and the biggest in the United States, is the state of Alabama. And that is entirely a product of right-to-work laws and similar influences in the shift of northern Rust Belt states are essentially a creation not just of jobs going overseas, but jobs going south. First, the invention of air conditioning. The invention of air conditioning made it possible to establish factories in the south and get the good old boys off the courthouse steps and into productive labour. And the second thing that it did was the right-to-work laws, which were universal in the south. Unions cannot get anywhere in the south at all. And so North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Georgia, and Alabama, Arkansas, quite substantial factories are being located, but the fellas in it are not being paid. Look, I'll finish on this, because this is the last Labor advertising that I'll do here. It's this. If the boss has assumed in good economic times high levels of profitability, somebody actually has to ask him for a wage rise. It doesn't happen naturally. The boss will look at the workforce and say, if I don't pay him another 10 grand a year, I won't keep Jim Bob, he'll go somewhere else. And he'll get the pay. And then he'll say, oh, geez, I've lost a number of skilled workers, I need to advertise for 3 more. Those 3 guys will get the pay. But the broad workforce doesn't. What happens here when the profit share is lifted in the economic system? Somebody turns up from the CFMEU or the AWU or whatever and says, Sport, in your next collective agreement, there'll be a $5,000 raise for everybody in your workforce. Does not happen in the US. Does happen here. 2.5 times wage growth and wealth for Australian workers, nothing for Americans in the last 30 years.
Now, we're over time. I'm going to take us to 6:45. Got a number of questions, but could I ask people to be brief and ask
Will be answers, will be brief too.
Thank you, Kim. Peter.
As Stephen said, we don't get to vote. We just have to live with the consequences. And I imagine the day after the election, probably on Martin Parkinson's desk, there'll be a set of talking points for Malcolm Turnbull to speak to whoever the new president is. All jokes aside, I mean, what should be the first few sentences that come out of an Australian Prime Minister's mouth in talking to the next American president? And will the alliance relationship be considered to be in good order in that as part of that discussion?
Brief replies from both Tom and Kim.
George H.W. Bush put it beautifully after he conceded defeat to Bill Clinton in 1992. We respect the majesty of the democratic system. This is the American people have spoken. And 2 nations look forward to having close security intelligence ties. The US alliance has been, for the last 65 years, the centrepiece of our defence and foreign policy, and it will continue to be for the foreseeable future. I think normal programming would resume under Hillary Clinton. I don't think there'd be dramatic change. If anything, she represents the more liberal interventionist wing of the Democratic Party. So she's the heir to folks like Harry Truman, Jack Kennedy, Scoop Jackson, Hubert Humphrey, Joe Lieberman, that wing of the party. So I think in many respects she'd probably be more, Sam Nunn from Georgia, she'd be more interventionist. She herself has taken issue with the president, her own president, on Syria. She thinks there should be a no-fly zone, whereas the president doesn't want to do that because that might increase the prospects of tensions with Russia. And I think she's a genuine believer in the pivot, although she has, as we've mentioned, done an about-face on the TPP. But I think all things considered, she would be the best thing for Australia. As for Trump, Kim's better at talking about this because he got a lot of attention on this today. But I don't think the alliance would be at risk under Trump. I generally don't. I've had this confirmed from a couple of reliable sources. And I think that he would put in place folks who might appear at first glance erratic, but they're internationalists and they are very pro-alliance. And I'm thinking of people like John Bolton and Newt Gingrich. I think those folks, they would not go after Australia. To the extent that alliances may be under review, would probably be more likely NATO, because this is the big issue that Trump's been rallying against. NATO, according to Trump, are freeloaders. 23, 24 out of the 28 member states have defence spending less than 1.5% of GDP, I think. And from Trump's perspective, NATO is a Cold War relic. And its expansion east, this is Trump's argument, has merely provoked the bear. So I think NATO would be in his sights, not so much ANZUS.
Look, I think on the Hillary side, I absolutely agree with Tom. That's the speech that should be made. On the Trump side, the first paragraph of that speech should be made. And that is, we respect the decisions taken by a democratic people freely electing a democratic a president. And we take the view that America and we are strongly great friends with a strong understandings of each other, strong understanding of what needs to be done. I have to say that I do not believe the direction of Mr. Trump's policy is in the interest of the United States or of Australia or of the Western Alliance generally, or of the economic development of our region and, more importantly, the global economy. And the time has come for us to have a conversation about this, and we will. We'll do it on the basis that we are a strong ally and will continue to be a strong ally of the United States, deeply embedded in their military and in the intelligence system. But the time will be there for a hard conversation with us because this cannot persist. Wow.
Something Donald Trump might care to consider, as a German defence minister has pointed out to Washington, that if Germany increased its defence spending to 2% of GDP within a very short period of time, it would have greater military capability than both Britain and France combined. And is that what the United States wants? Doug, I think you had a question, didn't you?
This is Doug Keane from ONA. This is a predictable and perhaps slightly desperate question, seeking some good news. If Trump is elected, then will good, patriotic, dutiful Americans grit their teeth and work for him and with him, and would he listen?
Enough would. Huntsman's been tipped more recently for Secretary of State. I don't think it would be Bolton.
Explain John Huntsman. Some people may not know Huntsman.
Huntsman was Obama's ambassador in China. Prior to that, he'd been Republican governor of Utah and a Republican senator.
And he got smashed in 2012.
And he got smashed in 2012, but he is talking to Trump. And
which is intriguing because he's a moderate, isn't he?
He's a moderate.
Mm.
And there was some rumour around that actually it would be Huntsman and not Bolton. Which would be a relief. If it's Bolton, you get Trump on speed. And intelligent. He'd know what to do. Look, I think there'd be a coming around him. I don't give them much chance of influencing in any direction in which he forms the judgment that if he pursues that advice, his constituency will think they've been let down. That's going to be a hard one, a very hard one. They will have to be able to form believable verbal tricks to get him into a sensible position, and that's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, we can't answer that question. No one really can, but one should not underestimate the degree to which so many establishment Republicans loathe this man on a wide range of issues. I mentioned before, Trump is upending the House of Reagan.
Yeah.
This is not the party of Reagan at the moment. This is the party of a European right-wing populist, if you like, and that's not in the Republican Party's DNA. And the bigger question, I think, assuming that he loses, is what then happens to the Republican Party and the broader conservative movement in the United States. It's showing all sorts of signs of splintering into several cantankerous factions.
I think quietly in a number of areas, impeachment considerations are starting to be studied.
The key player in the Republican Party foreign policy establishment may turn out to be Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. There's also the funniest person in the Republican Party at the moment. Now, two people. He's the one who said of Bernie Sanders, Bernie went off to a honeymoon in the Soviet Union but never came back. Now, two people have been very patient. There's a person here and a person there, and I'm going to take the two questions now, and we'll have responses. Please, ma'am.
My question's, Debbie Chambers from Defence. My question's in regard to Trump's supporter base, and you raised the issue that they are dissatisfied with elites and the increasing inequity within the United States. Trump has come out and made a policy statement that he wants to reduce corporate tax from 35% to, this could be incorrect, 15%. How will that affect his
You might well ask.
And you, sir.
I'm Joel from the Treasury. I'll try and keep this very short. So most accept that America's internationalism is declining in the face of growing inequality. We prefer them to be more internationalist. But does America have the ability, the wherewithal to fight that inequality? Do the tax and transfers required to do that? And if not, do we have to accept that they're going to just veer into inward pacing? What can you do?
Tom, Kim, brief responses, please.
Debbie, that's a great question. I thought that Trump in his speech at Detroit yesterday was trying to reassure the conservative Reaganite Republican voters that he would govern in that quintessential centre-right Reaganite manner. That's why he did that. But you're quite right, that does go against the economic interests of many of the so-called white working class folks who are his rump. I will say this about Trump's economic policy. He wants to impose a 45% tariff on Chinese goods and services and a 35% tariff on Mexican goods and services. Now, among other things, that would not bring back jobs for those folks who have been displaced by globalisation and moreover technology. But more importantly, I think those kind of tariff policies, which are reminiscent of Herbert Hoover in the late 20s, early 1930s, another Republican protectionist, would increase consumer prices for the very folks he's ostensibly trying to help,
Yep.
right? You know, Walmart, they rely on cheap goods and services. Those prices will go through the roof. And I think that will also spark a trade war and probably a global economic downturn, much like Hoover's did. So that's how I'd respond to that. On your very good question, I'm no authority on this very question, but there are, in the course of the last 2 years, Fukuyama mentions them. Charles Murray, a distinguished libertarian conservative intellectual at the American Enterprise Institute, Robert Putnam, a more liberal economist, sociologist from Harvard University. They've written some groundbreaking books addressing those very issues. And their argument, and Fukuyama's argument, is that we will start to see over the next 4 to 6 years policymakers on both sides addressing this very real issue of inequality.
Look, I absolutely agree with what Tom had to say, Debbie. I think that's basically the answer. Your question more complex than the $64,000 question. My answer to that is no. It is not possible to put in place in the current policy settings or anything like it major shifts towards equality, and you have to look at the character of our two federal budgets. I used to point this out to Americans, because basically our outlays are the same. About 26% there, I think 25% there is about 26% here. Their outlays are massively in defence and in things like social security, but from that point on, it's basically bits and pieces of initiatives. You know, No Kid Left Behind, a whole range of issues to interfere in various areas of problem that are identified. When I then point out, what do we do with our 25%? Well, we have a certain amount of defence, nothing like what you have. But we have age pensions. We have supporting parents' benefits. We have a range of support mechanisms for people picking up private health care. We have a set of Section 96 grants made to the states that underpin the education system. 1/3 of our kids are in private schools, and basically the taxpayer carries about 2/3 of the cost, perhaps a bit more, of kids in private schools. We fund all the universities from the Commonwealth government, and they just sort of sit gobsmacked by this. So why is it? Well, we have efficient means testing and you have none, and we don't have to carry the massive burden of defence in the way in which you do. Most of what we've done, including healthcare, I should have added in that, hospitals and life, most of what we've done is a direct outgrowth of the social wage put in place by the Hawke and Keating governments in the 1980s and accompanied by quite a substantial middle class tax cut which has disappeared from Australian public gaze. And the Commonwealth is sort of at the centre of a social wage which basically was enough, along with successful wage claims, to keep the displaced workers off the back of the political system and not be voting for Hanson or anyone else at this point of time. There is no capacity in the United States for a social wage. In the way in which authority is divided. The essence of the campaign by the Libertarians and the Tea Party and the right is against federal government. They want a confederacy. They want these issues handled at the state level. Because when these issues are handled at the state level, provision of education, provision of healthcare, provision of public housing, it can be handled in accordance with the view of the majority race. And they no longer have to find themselves situated in circumstances where there is a means tested, if you like, very, very generally described, because they're not directly means tested, donation to minorities and this sort of thing, and the beneficiaries can be held to being essentially the population that is the majority population in the state. American kids are not educated in private schools. They're educated in public schools. Here it's 30%, there it's 10%. And in the 90%, they're in the public sector. And the public sector is paid for not by the federal government in any shape or form, as no universities are in any shape or form. But universities are, in some ways, at the state level. They're provided by bonds, by aspects of state government, by regional authorities, by local authorities, all with some system of rating or bond raising that is related to it. So all this sort of stuff, which is social wage stuff, there in the United States is a matter of state organisation. But fundamentally, state organisation for the benefit of the majority class. The federal government tries in different ways to sort of equalise this a bit. But in doing so, it means that when they portray what happens to their tax dollar at the federal level, it all seems to be going either to minorities or the very rich. I don't believe the United States can handle this problem at the federal level, and God knows what the consequences of that are going to be.
And on that sobering note, could I thank everyone for attending what has turned out to be a forum that's exceeded expectations, insightful, enlightening, a truly unique penetration of American politics. So thanks to everyone for being here. Please join us for a drink. Thanks to Peter Jennings and the team, Renee Jones and others who put the forum together tonight. On your behalf, ladies and gentlemen, could I thank the very gifted Tom Switzer and the magnificent Kim Beazley.